The Toronto Maple Leafs have gone full fire sale this offseason, already getting rid of Kyle Dubas and likely getting rid of Sheldon Keefe as well. But with the Leafs' new GM search, they're looking for an experienced GM. We've seen a ton of names come out recently linked to them, but one of the biggest names and one of the most likely names linked to them is former Habs GM MARC BERGEVIN. But what are the latest trade rumors surrounding the Toronto Maple Leafs? Will MARC BERGEVIN actually be the next GM of the Leafs? And what will MARC BERGEVIN look like in Toronto? And what could that Leafs future look like with BERGEVIN at the helm? Watch till the end for all the news and subscribe if you're new for daily hockey content just like this. You won't want to miss it. Now let's talk about MARC BERGEVIN here for a second. His link to the Toronto Maple Leafs. First, we got to talk about how, of course, his tenure went with Montreal. It went badly. It went poorly. And even though there were some highlights, there were some big moments going to the 2021 Stanley Cup final, for the most part, it was a failure that failed to really reach those lofty expectations. He ended up being fired in November 2021, and then in January of 2022, he was hired by the Kings as a senior advisor to the general manager. And with MARC BERGEVIN being an advisor to the GM, they oversaw two different trade deadlines. The first one wasn't too active, but in the 2022 offseason, they went out and got Kevin Fiala, and I think a pretty solid deal for them. And then, of course, this last NHL trade deadline, it was humongous. You had the huge Jonathan Quick, Korpisalo deal, as well as Gavrikov coming out of the LA Kings, and some pretty big moves. And even though that didn't result in too much playoff success, on paper, these were solid trades and solid moves to make. But trades might be solid on paper, but again, if you're not going to have that playoff success, it doesn't matter. Back-to-back losses in the first round versus the Edmonton Oilers in 2 years where there was definitely potential, and even points where they were looking like they might win that series, but they were unable to get the job done in the end. And now MARC BERGEVIN has the chance to go to another team, and the Toronto Maple Leafs seem like the most likely bet. Now again, talking about the Leafs and their GM search from Mike Stevens and right directly from Brandon Shanahan, talking about what they want in the next GM. Certainly having an experienced general manager would be attractive. Now MARC BERGEVIN is a lot of things. Experienced is definitely one of them. Now interestingly, it's not just the Toronto Maple Leafs that are going after MARC BERGEVIN. From Denny Shirley, the Penguins have indeed spoken with MARC BERGEVIN, though I've been told he might be viewed as a better fit for president of hockey operations. So it really just puts into perspective how coveted MARC BERGEVIN is, that they might not even be going for him as the GM, but as the director of hockey operations for the entire organization. That's pretty lofty praise, and again, if it's not Toronto getting him, some other team will likely hire him. But then we go on to the bombshell quote here from Elliotte Friedman on 32 Thoughts, talking about the Leafs GM and potential candidates for the spot. One of the names that's making a lot of rounds right now is Mark Hunter. I think you're going to hear MARC BERGEVIN as well. And this is the big link. Elliotte Friedman tossing out two different big names, Mark Hunter as well as MARC BERGEVIN. BERGEVIN especially would be fascinating on Toronto. Now, Mark Hunter is also a fascinating name in this because of his linkage to the Toronto Maple Leafs already. You can see he was a GM with the London Knights, the owner of the London Knights for a long time. And then with the Leafs was hired in 2014 and was in a bunch of different roles, and then ended up leaving in 2018, shortly after Dubas was named general manager. So the Leafs could come full circle and hire him as their next GM after he left once Dubas was hired. Now, what's also interesting is the willingness from the Leafs players, too, for massive sweeping changes. From this part in the Hockey Writers article talking about Leafs rumors, Maple Leafs exit interviews in the core four, reports from Elliotte Friedman suggest the team's exit interviews that followed this postseason were far from pleasant. He said, "I heard Toronto's exit interviews were pretty tough. I heard the Toronto Maple Leafs players were pretty blunt about what they thought was said, and that's something still to work on. He thinks some of the players were really blunt about why it didn't work." And then interestingly, in this next part, while there were no names dropped, the suggestion here is that some of the players expect change. At the same time, Chris Johnson at TSN said that the Leafs president Brandon Shanahan personally phoned players to inform them he was cutting ties with former GM Kyle Dubas on Friday. And the feeling coming out of those calls was that Shanahan was inclined to forge ahead with the core four forwards still in place next season, according to sources. So it seems like from everything we've seen, the Leafs are begging for some new changes, begging to maybe some new changes at the very top, and the GM is obviously one of the biggest aspects. MARC BERGEVIN is going to be a really interesting hire if he is going to end up being the guy. He was a player that had some interesting relationships with some Habs players over the years. With Toronto, though, he could be interesting on a team like that. If Marc Bergevin was known as anything, he was an absolute gunslinger. He was not afraid to make trades, wasn't afraid to make deals when it was necessary or deemed necessary to him. And even though some of those deals didn't end up working out, he was somebody that did not accept those awful years. He would be making changes even if they didn't end up working out. And he wasn't afraid to make changes to the core people in the franchise, the core players on the team. And even though Shanahan might want to keep the core four around, a GM like Bergevin might have other ideas, but at the very least would still make some pretty sweeping changes, I bet, to this Leafs roster. And I think if you sat Marc Bergevin down and said, hey, you can't trade the core four, but everybody else besides maybe like Morgan Rielly is fair game, I think Marc Bergevin at the very least would be able to make some massive trades, some massive deals. And it might not work out, but the changes would be coming to this Leafs roster if Bergevin were to come and helm the top of the roster. You look at this Leafs roster and what Marc Bergevin is going to likely deal with. There's so much turnover that'll be happening here. And if the core four is protected, if that core four, maybe even Morgan Rielly is protected, there's still a lot of changes that will be coming to this Leafs roster, especially if Marc Bergevin were to come at the very top. He's a GM that is not afraid to make those big decisions, especially in the offseason, is not afraid to make big trades. I think the NHL is better when Marc Bergevin is a GM just because of how much chaos he puts out there. You can see with the Leafs 4 group and what they're going with, they have 7 UFAs in this upcoming offseason. It's going to be a hectic job for no matter who comes into that GM spot. You can see big time guys like Michael Bunting and Alexander Kerfoot and Ryan O'Reilly. And even though I would say Kerfoot, Bunting are almost 100% gone, you can maybe sign maybe a Ryan O'Reilly to a cheaper pay cut deal if you maybe get some good hope. We'll see what happens there, but that might be the bigger player they're able to re-sign we'll end up seeing. But you can see they don't have a lot of guys locked up long term. The only guy they have locked up for the next 3 years is Calle Jarnkrok. So it's going to be a lot of interesting decisions to be made. And then you even look on that defense and goaltending, which is wild. Even though the defense has gotten the job done these past couple of years, there is still likely to be some massive turnover. You've got Gustafsson, Hull, and Luke Schenn, all his UFAs. Maybe they keep Schenn. That might be the most likely bet, but I would say Hull and Gustafsson are almost 100% gone, just like Bunting and Alexander Kerfoot. But you can see the defense is, again, not a lot of guys locked up long term, only really Morgan Rielly there. You can see younger guys like Timothy Liljegren. What do they do there? That's a huge question mark. And then you go on to the biggest question mark in the goaltending. Do you keep it the same? Do you ride just Joseph Woll and Ilya Samsonov? Do you think that's going to be good enough? Of course, you got Samsonov being an RFA. He'll need to be re-signed. Then you go, of course, got the Matt Murray contract at $4.6 million. Do you get rid of that deal? Do you keep it somehow? Do you try to retain on a trade? It'll be a lot of question marks with this Leafs roster. But again, if you need a GM who's going to go out there and create some fireworks, Marc Bergevin is your guy. But no matter what, there's going to be some massive surgery here, and Marc Bergevin is experienced in creating that surgery. We'll see if the Leafs are his next patient here, but to me, if there's going to be a GM to make some airwaves, it's going to be Marc Bergevin, and of course, him being in the Montreal market before, he knows how to work the Canadian market and be in that market. It is a question whether he'll actually want to go back there. We'll end up seeing, but I would say Marc Bergevin, even if he might not be a good fit in terms of making good trades, he'd certainly be a good fit in making trades at the very least. But still, even in saying that, I don't think Marc Bergevin is the right guy for the job. I think in maybe like an advisor to the GM, that type of role, sure, I think he could provide some value. Being the main guy, though, for a huge Canadian market, I think Marc Bergevin has shown in the past that he isn't able to handle that completely. Whether he believes in that differently or not, we'll obviously have to wait and see. Him being higher at Toronto would definitely still show some confidence in himself in a Canadian market. But at the same time, I think Marc Bergevin, maybe in a type of world like Pittsburgh would be better for him. But in Toronto, with the expectations and the pressure, it didn't really happen all too well. It didn't really work all too well in the first go around with Montreal. I don't see why it would be all too different in the second go with Toronto and the position they're in. But I would say, at least for the Leafs, going after a top 6 forward in this offseason, going after somebody that can play on that first line, that can be consistent in the playoffs, is a big necessity. And of course, even though you'll lose some players like Bunting, maybe even like a Camp, maybe even a Kerfoot, foot. I think there will be some big trades we will see, maybe even a couple of UFA signings. But Marc Bergevin would definitely be an interesting bet to make it happen. The Leafs, though, are in definite need of some roster construction, and they need it as soon as possible. But I want to know in the comments down below, what do you guys think about Marc Bergevin potentially being the GM of the Toronto Maple Leafs? So let us know how you think he would do down below, and do you think he'll actually end up being the GM for Toronto? Let us know all your thoughts. Of course, hit that subscribe button, hit that like button, hit that notification bell for more trade rumor content just like this. Share the video with all the hockey fans you guys know online, all the Leafs fans you guys know online, and click on this card up here for all my trade rumor content right in one playlist. My name is Nathan, and have a great day. I will see you in the next one. Goodbye.